The family business has been sold. Your share is $10,000. The words hung in the air of my late husband's study, as foreign and incomprehensible as if they'd been spoken in another language. I looked up from the antique desk where Richard had worked for decades, my fingers still tracing the worn leather surface where his hands had rested just weeks ago. "I'm sorry, Oliver. What did you just say?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt, which was fortunate. At 68, I'd become quite skilled at maintaining composure, even when my world was collapsing. First Richard's sudden stroke 3 weeks ago, then the funeral I'd somehow navigated in a fog of grief, and now this. My only son standing before me with a document and an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "It's all here, Mom." Oliver slid the paper across the desk, his manicured fingernails a stark contrast to the calluses his father had earned building Bradford Precision Technologies from nothing. "I know it's a shock, but Dad had been considering offers for months. The deal just happened to close after everything." I glanced down at the document. A single page with surprisingly little detail for something purporting to dissolve a company worth $13 million. $10,000, I repeated slowly. "For my share of a business your father and I built over 45 years of marriage." "Your share," Oliver emphasized, adjusting his Italian silk tie, a nervous habit he'd developed in boarding school. "Dad's controlling interest passed to me through the trust he established years ago. This is just the standard spousal compensation package based on the final sale price." Standard spousal compensation. As if I were a minor employee being offered a modest severance package rather than the woman who had stood beside Richard Bradford through 4 decades of struggle, sacrifice, and eventual success. "I see." I kept my tone neutral, even curious. "And who is the buyer? Another aerospace firm? One of our competitors?" Oliver hesitated just a fraction too long. "It's a private investment group, Monarch Holdings. They specialize in acquisitions of mid-sized manufacturing companies." "Monarch Holdings," I echoed, watching my son's face carefully. I don't believe Richard ever mentioned them. It was a recent development. Oliver's confidence seemed to return. "They approached us just before Dad's stroke, actually. The timing is unfortunate, but the deal is solid. They're maintaining operations and keeping most of the staff. It's what Dad would have wanted." "Was it?" I wondered, remembering Richard's raspy whisper during one of his last lucid moments in the hospital. "Amelia, promise me you'll protect what we built. Something's not right." At the time, I'd attributed his concern to the confusion that sometimes accompanies stroke victims. Now, I wasn't so sure. "When will I meet the new owners?" I asked, folding the document neatly and slipping it into the pocket of my cardigan. Oliver blinked, clearly not expecting this question. "There's no need for that, Mom. I've handled everything. You just need to sign the acknowledgement of payment, and then you can focus on adjusting to your new circumstances." My new circumstances. Widowhood, apparent poverty, exclusion from the company that had been as much a part of my identity as my marriage. How considerate of my son to manage it all so efficiently, just 3 days after we laid his father in the ground. $10,000 won't go very far, I observed mildly. The property taxes on this house alone are nearly that much annually. A flicker of something, annoyance, concern, crossed Oliver's face before his expression settled back into sympathetic efficiency. "We'll discuss your living arrangements soon. The estate is complicated. For now, this payment will help with immediate expenses." I nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "And the company valuation? $13 million seems rather low, considering the defense contracts Richard secured last year." Oliver's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mom, with all due respect, you've never been involved in the business side of things. The valuation reflects current market conditions and certain liabilities that have developed recently." There it was, the dismissal I'd anticipated. Poor, uninvolved Amelia, the corporate wife who arranged dinner parties and charity functions, while the men handled the important matters. How little they knew. "Of course," I conceded, rising from the chair with the dignity that had become my armor over decades of being underestimated. "You're right. Business was always your father's domain, not mine." Relief visibly washed over Oliver's features. He'd been prepared for tears, perhaps, or confused questions. Not this calm acceptance. "I'm glad you understand, Mom. This is best for everyone. The check will be deposited directly into your account tomorrow." "How convenient." I moved toward the door, signaling our conversation was ending on my terms, not his. And Oliver? Who exactly is behind Monarch Holdings? I'd at least like to know who owns your father's legacy now. It's a private investment consortium, he replied, the practiced answer of someone who had anticipated this question. Very discreet, very professional. Their managing director is someone named Elizabeth Windsor. British, I believe. I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corners of my mouth. Elizabeth Windsor? How interesting. You've heard of her? Oliver asked, sudden wariness creeping into his voice. The name sounds vaguely familiar, I replied, my hand on the doorknob now. Thank you for handling everything, Oliver. You've always been so efficient. After he left, I returned to Richard's desk and unlocked the hidden drawer only he and I knew about, removing a slim leather portfolio. Inside was a complete dossier on Monarch Holdings, including its incorporation documents, tax filings, and the name of its sole shareholder, Amelia Elizabeth Blackwood. My maiden name had been Windsor. I traced the elegant letterhead with fingers that no longer trembled. The company I'd secretly established 6 months ago when Richard first shared his suspicions about our son's financial manipulations. The company that had just purchased Bradford Precision Technologies for a fraction of its worth, thanks to the falsified valuation documents Oliver had so helpfully provided to the buyer's representatives. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. My husband's longtime attorney, Jonathan Mercer, was calling exactly on schedule. "Is it done?" he asked without preamble. "Yes," I confirmed. "Oliver just informed me of the sale. $10,000 for my share, just as you predicted he would offer." Jonathan's laugh was without humor. "And did he mention who the buyer was?" "Monarch Holdings, apparently owned by someone named Elizabeth Windsor." "Yeah, and did he recognize the significance of the name?" "No," I said, looking at the wedding photograph on Richard's desk. Me in ivory lace, young and smiling beside my brilliant, ambitious husband. "He has no idea he just sold his father's company to his mother. The board meeting is scheduled for Friday," Jonathan reminded me. "That gives us 3 days to prepare. Are you ready for this, Amelia? Once we move forward, there's no going back." I thought of Richard's final, urgent whisper, of 45 years building something meaningful, of my son's casual dismissal of my role in all of it. "I've been ready for this my entire life," I replied. "Oliver just doesn't know it yet." As I hung up the phone, I allowed myself one moment of doubt. Was I really prepared to confront my only child? To dismantle the carefully constructed fraud he'd built? To step out of the shadows and into the harsh light of corporate power? The answer came in Richard's voice, as clear as if he were standing beside me. "Show them who you really are, Amelia. Show them the woman I've always seen." It was time to do exactly that. If this story of betrayal and secret strength has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe. What exactly has Oliver been doing with the family business? And what will happen when he discovers who's really behind Monarch Holdings? The game has only just begun. Jonathan Mercer's office offered a stark contrast to the heavy mahogany and leather of Richard's study. All glass, steel, and modern angles, it reflected the attorney's practical approach to life, transparent yet unyielding. I'd known Jonathan for nearly 4 decades, since he was a freshly minted lawyer handling Richard's first significant contract negotiations. "You look remarkably composed for someone who just discovered her son has attempted to cheat her out of millions," he observed, sliding a cup of tea across his desk. "Appearances are deceiving, Jonathan," I replied, accepting the cup. "Something Oliver seems to have forgotten." The attorney nodded, retrieving a sleek tablet from his drawer. "I've finalized the paperwork for Friday's board meeting. Once you're officially introduced as the owner of Monarch Holdings, we'll need to move quickly. Oliver will undoubtedly attempt to challenge the acquisition." "On what grounds?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. We'd been planning this counter-move for months. "Diminished capacity, most likely." Jonathan's expression softened slightly. "He'll claim you weren't of sound mind following Richard's death, that you were manipulated by outside forces, meaning me, to seize control of the company." I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped me. Diminished capacity. The same argument he was preparing to use if Richard had lived long enough to confront him about the missing funds. Precisely. Jonathan tapped the tablet, bringing up a series of complex financial spreadsheets. "Speaking of which, our forensic accountants have completed their analysis. It's worse than we initially suspected." I steeled myself. Show me. For the next hour, Jonathan methodically walked me through the evidence of my son's betrayal. Falsified inventory reports, offshore accounts receiving mysterious payments from competitors, patents sold under market value to shell companies that, when traced back through layers of corporate obfuscation, belonged to Oliver himself. He's been systematically hollowing out the company for at least 3 years, Jonathan concluded. If Richard hadn't noticed the discrepancies in the quarterly reports last year, Richard always did have an exceptional memory for numbers, I interjected quietly, even when he was pretending not to care about the details during board meetings. A trait our son had apparently underestimated in both his parents. The most egregious issue is the employee pension fund, Jonathan continued, pulling up another document. Oliver has been using it as collateral for personal loans. If we hadn't intercepted the sale to his shell company, those employees would have lost everything when the fund inevitably collapsed. I set down my teacup with deliberate control, fighting the wave of disappointment and anger threatening to overwhelm my carefully maintained composure. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were the retirement savings of people who had worked alongside Richard for decades, people who had attended our Christmas parties, whose children had received college recommendation letters from us, whose life milestones had been marked with personal cards and gifts. Does he truly believe he would have gotten away with this? I asked, more to myself than to Jonathan. People who commit financial fraud typically share 2 characteristics, the attorney replied. Exceptional confidence in their own cleverness and absolute certainty that rules apply only to others. He closed the tablet with a decisive snap. Oliver possesses both in abundance. Just like his grandfather, I murmured, remembering Richard's difficult relationship with his own father, a man whose gambling addiction had nearly destroyed the family before his son was even born. Jonathan nodded soberly. The board meets at 10 on Friday morning. Oliver will be expecting to introduce the new ownership team from Monarch Holdings, specifically the mysterious Elizabeth Windsor he believes he's been negotiating with through intermediaries. And instead, he'll get me. I smoothed my dress, a nervous habit from childhood that resurfaced in moments of stress. What about the board members? Can they be trusted? 2 are firmly in Oliver's pocket, Henderson and Patterson. They've benefited directly from his schemes. The others are either loyal to Richard's memory or completely in the dark. Jonathan slid a folder across the desk. This contains dossiers on each member, including what we know about their involvement or lack thereof. I accepted the folder, suddenly aware of the weight of what we were undertaking. And the employees? How do we protect them when this becomes public? The acquisition structure shields the operational side of the business from any legal repercussions. Your controlling interest through Monarch ensures that production continues uninterrupted. Jonathan hesitated, then added, but there will be questions, Amelia. Shock, possibly anger directed at the entire Blackwood family. Better temporary anger than permanent destitution, I replied, thinking of the pension fund and the families who depended on it. Richard built this company on integrity and innovation. I won't let Oliver destroy that legacy through greed and shortcuts. As I gathered my belongings to leave, Jonathan asked the question he'd been delicately avoiding throughout our meeting. And after Friday? Have you decided what happens to Oliver? The maternal instinct to protect my child warred with the moral obligation to hold him accountable. In my mind's eye, I saw Oliver as a small boy, earnestly explaining his Lego creations. As a teenager, awkwardly navigating his first school dance. As a young man, standing proud in his graduation robes with Richard beaming beside him. Where had that boy gone? When had ambition curdled into avarice? That depends on him, I finally answered. On whether he can face what he's done with honesty and remorse. Jonathan's expression suggested he had significant doubts on that front, but he merely nodded. I'll have a car pick you up at 9 on Friday. Try to get some rest before then. Rest. As if sleep were possible with the weight of Friday's confrontation looming. As if I could close my eyes without seeing Richard's face in those final hospital days, his features contorted with the effort to communicate what he'd discovered about our son. In the lobby of Jonathan's building, I checked my phone to find 3 missed calls from Oliver and a text message. We need to discuss the house. Can you meet tomorrow? The estate agent has some questions. The estate agent. As if our family home, the place where Richard and I had raised him, where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where my husband had taken his last breath, was just another asset to be liquidated. I typed a simple reply. Certainly. Your father's study, 2 p.m. Let him come to me, I thought. Let him sit in his father's chair and tell me to my face that he planned to sell the house out from under me while offering a pittance from the company's true value. It would be our last conversation with the power dynamic he'd always assumed, the knowledgeable son managing his father's affairs, while his mother passively accepted whatever crumbs he deigned to offer. On Friday, that dynamic would shatter beyond repair. The only question remaining was whether our relationship as mother and son would shatter along with it. As my driver navigated the afternoon traffic, I found myself remembering a conversation with Richard early in our marriage. I'd just completed my finance degree, graduating with honors despite juggling classes with caring for an infant Oliver. You could be formidable in the business world, Amelia, Richard had observed, watching me review his company's first serious investment proposal. You see patterns and weaknesses I miss entirely. Perhaps someday, I'd replied, distracted by the errors I was finding in the prospective partner's valuation model. But for now, the company needs you full-time, and Oliver needs me. Just promise me something, Richard had said, taking the proposal and my meticulous notes. Don't let that brilliant financial mind go to waste forever. The world has enough homemakers. It doesn't have enough Amelia Blackwoods. 45 years later, I was finally keeping that promise, and Oliver was about to discover that his mother had been paying very close attention all along. Oliver arrived at precisely 2:00 p.m., punctuality being one of the few traits he'd genuinely inherited from his father. He wasn't alone. A sleek woman in her mid-30s accompanied him, her expertly tailored suit and predatory smile identifying her as the estate agent before introductions were even made. "Mom, this is Vanessa Hargrove from Prestige Properties," Oliver said, guiding the woman forward with a hand at the small of her back, a gesture too familiar for mere professional acquaintance. "She specializes in luxury estates like this one." I offered my hand with the practiced grace of a woman who had hosted hundreds of corporate events. "Miss Hargrove, I wasn't aware we had progressed to engaging real estate services already." A flicker of confusion crossed Vanessa's features as she glanced at Oliver. "I understood from Mr. Blackwood that you had agreed to list the property immediately. Did you?" I turned my attention to my son, whose expression remained carefully neutral, despite the slight tightening around his eyes. How efficient of him to make these arrangements during our mourning period. Oliver cleared his throat. "Mom, we discussed this. The house is too large for you to manage alone, and the maintenance costs." "Did we discuss it?" I interrupted gently. "I don't recall that conversation. Perhaps it was scheduled for some time after you informed me that my share of your father's company, our company, was worth a mere $10,000. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly at the figure, her gaze darting between us as she sensed the undercurrents. Oliver's smile remained fixed, though it no longer reached his eyes. "Perhaps Ms. Hargrove could wait in the living room while we clarify a few family matters," I suggested, my tone making it clear this wasn't actually a request. Once Vanessa had retreated, closing the study door behind her, Oliver's carefully constructed facade cracked. "Really, Mom? You had to bring up the settlement in front of her?" "Settlement," I repeated, testing the word like a suspicious morsel. "Is that what we're calling it now? Not theft? Not fraud? That's completely unfair," he snapped, dropping into Richard's leather chair without invitation. "The company valuation was conducted by independent analysts. The offer was fair market value considering the current liabilities. Liabilities that appeared quite suddenly under your management," I noted, remaining standing. "How convenient." Oliver's expression hardened into something I barely recognized, a cold calculation that bore no resemblance to the boy I'd raised. "I don't expect you to understand complex corporate finance, Mom. Dad protected you from the business realities for decades." "Protected me," I echoed. "Or excluded me. The distinction matters, don't you think?" "This isn't productive," Oliver said dismissively. "The company has been sold. The house needs to be liquidated to settle outstanding estate issues. I found you a lovely assisted living community near Charlotte where—" "Charlotte?" I couldn't contain my surprise. 6 hours away from everything and everyone I know? It's exclusive, beautiful grounds, full-service amenities." He spoke as if describing a luxury hotel rather than exiling his mother to a facility hundreds of miles from her home. "The proceeds from this house will easily cover your residence there for years." I studied my son's face, searching for any trace of the child I had raised, the boy who had once crawled into my lap during thunderstorms, the teenager who had called me first when he got accepted to Princeton, the young man who had wept openly at his wedding as Richard and I watched proudly from the front row. Instead, I saw only a stranger wearing my son's features, calculating the value of my remaining years against the square footage of the home where he'd grown up. "And if I decline this generous arrangement?" I asked, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "If I prefer to remain in my home of 40 years? Oliver sighed with exaggerated patience. "Mom, be reasonable. This house is part of Dad's estate. I'm the executor. These decisions aren't actually optional." "I see." I moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where Richard and I had spent countless Sunday mornings, planning our future over coffee while Oliver played on the lawn. "And my preferences count for nothing in this equation?" "Your emotional attachment to this property isn't a factor in estate management," he replied, the corporate jargon creating further distance between us. "Vanessa already has interested buyers. We could close within 30 days. I turned back to face him, something shifting irreversibly inside me. The last threads of maternal protection, the instinct to shield him from consequences, to find excuses for his behavior, finally snapped. "No," I said simply. Oliver blinked, clearly unprepared for direct opposition. No, I will not be moving to Charlotte. No, this house will not be sold. And no, your handling of your father's estate is not acceptable to me." His surprise quickly hardened into irritation. "You don't actually have a choice here, Mom. The legal documentation is clear. As executor, yes," I interrupted. "Not sole heir, not sole owner. Did you even read Richard's will completely, or just the parts that granted you authority?" Uncertainty flickered across his features. "Of course I read it. The estate passes to me, with provisions for your care." "The estate," I corrected gently, "is held in trust, with you as executor, under specific conditions. One of those conditions is obtaining written consent from me for any sale of real property." Oliver's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "That's not possible." "Peterson reviewed everything." "Jeffrey Peterson," I supplied. "Your personal attorney, not your father's. A distinction that appears increasingly significant." I crossed to Richard's desk, removed a key from my pocket, and unlocked the top drawer. From it, I withdrew a leather-bound document bearing the letterhead of Mercer and Associates. "This is the actual will, Oliver, not the summary Mr. Peterson provided to you." Color drained from my son's face as he stared at the document. "Where did you get that?" "From your father, who gave me explicit instructions about where to find it and when to produce it." I placed the will on the desk between us. It seems Richard had concerns about how his affairs would be handled after his death. Concerns that appear to have been entirely justified. Oliver reached for the document, but I placed my hand firmly on top of it. "Section 14, paragraph C, specifically prohibits the sale of this property without my written authorization. Paragraph D establishes that my residency cannot be terminated without my consent, regardless of other estate considerations." "This can't be legal," Oliver muttered, more to himself than to me. "Dad changed everything before we could." He stopped abruptly, realizing his near admission. "Before you could what?" I asked quietly. "Before you could complete the transfer of company assets? Before you could remove my name from the property deeds? Before your father realized exactly what was happening under his nose?" Oliver stood so suddenly that the chair rolled backward and struck the bookcase. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Dad was confused toward the end, making accusations, seeing problems where none existed. Was he? I kept my voice calm despite the storm of emotions raging beneath my composed exterior. "Perhaps we should discuss those accusations at Friday's board meeting. I believe you're introducing the new owners of Bradford Precision Technologies to the executive team." Something in my tone must have alerted him, because Oliver's expression shifted from defensive anger to wary calculation. "What do you know about the board meeting?" "Only what any informed shareholder would know." I smiled faintly. Though in my case, a shareholder whose stake was apparently worth just $10,000, rather less than one would expect for a company valued at $13 million. Wouldn't you agree? "Mom, you're upset. Grief can make people paranoid. See conspiracies. Not paranoia, Oliver. Clarity." I moved toward the door. I believe Miss Hargrove has waited long enough. Please inform her that the house will not be sold after all. This isn't over, he warned, his voice low. You have no idea what you're getting involved in. On the contrary, I replied, opening the door. For the first time in decades, I know exactly what I'm involved in. I'll see you Friday at the board meeting. Do give my regards to Elizabeth Windsor when you speak with her. As Oliver and a visibly confused Vanessa departed, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The shock in my son's eyes when I mentioned Elizabeth Windsor, the fictitious owner of Monarch Holdings, confirmed what Jonathan and I had suspected. Oliver had never bothered to investigate the company purchasing Bradford Precision Technologies. His greed and haste had blinded him to even basic due diligence. I returned to Richard's desk and picked up our wedding photograph, tracing the outline of his younger face through the glass. The first move is complete, I whispered to his image. He suspects something's wrong, but he has no idea what's coming. In 2 days, Oliver would discover exactly who he had been negotiating with all these months. He would learn that his mother was not the decorative corporate wife he had dismissed, but a woman with both the intellect and the resolve to protect what mattered, even from her own son. And perhaps most painfully, he would finally understand that Richard had known everything. He's been making inquiries, Jonathan informed me over the phone Thursday morning. Urgent ones. 3 calls to the Monarch Holdings office yesterday afternoon. Multiple requests for direct contact with Elizabeth Windsor. I sipped my tea, standing at the kitchen window where weak spring sunshine illuminated the garden. Richard's prized roses were beginning to bud, a reminder that life continued its cycles regardless of human drama. What response did he receive? Exactly what we planned. His calls were professionally fielded by the service, with assurances that Ms. Windsor is traveling, but looks forward to meeting everyone at tomorrow's board introduction. Jonathan's voice held a note of satisfaction. He also contacted 3 separate law firms specializing in estate litigation. Moving quickly, I observed. He knows something is wrong, but not what. Precisely. He's scrambling without direction. Jonathan paused. Amelia, are you certain you want to go through with this? Once tomorrow's meeting begins, there's no turning back. The question gave me pause. Despite everything, Oliver was still my son. The baby I had nursed through colic and chickenpox. The child whose nightmares I had soothed, the young man whose graduation had filled me with such fierce pride that my chest ached with it. But he was also the adult who had systematically betrayed his father's trust, who had attempted to steal from loyal employees, who had been prepared to send his mother to an assisted living facility 6 hours away with nothing but a token payment from a company worth millions. I'm certain, I replied, my voice steady. What time will you collect me tomorrow? After ending the call, I made my way to Richard's study, drawn there as I had been every day since his death. The room still held his presence so strongly that sometimes I imagined I could hear the tap of his fingers on the keyboard, smell the faint bergamot of his preferred tea. I settled at his desk and opened my laptop, not the family computer Oliver believed I used solely for viewing grandchildren's photos and recipe websites, but a high-performance system Richard had insisted I maintain separately from the family network. Operational security, he'd called it with a wink, though at the time I'd thought he was being excessive. Now I understood his foresight. Oliver had never suspected that I maintained my own secure email server, or that Richard and I had communicated through encrypted channels about company matters for years. He certainly never imagined that his father had granted me administrative access to Bradford Precision's internal systems long before his health began to fail. I logged in using credentials Oliver didn't know existed and began reviewing the latest activity. Since our confrontation yesterday, he had been frantically accessing files, financial records, ownership documents, board minutes from the last 5 years. Most concerning, he had downloaded the complete employee stock ownership plan documents, focusing on the legal mechanisms through which those holdings could be dissolved. My phone chimed with a text from an unfamiliar number. Mrs. Blackwood, this is Marcus Torres from Bradford Precision's Engineering Division. Something strange is happening with our project files. Can we speak privately? Marcus had been with the company for nearly 20 years, rising from junior technician to head of special projects. Richard had often spoken of his brilliant design work and uncompromising integrity. I replied immediately, "Of course. Are you at liberty to come to the house? 4 p.m.? His response was swift. "We'll be there. Thank you." The doorbell rang precisely at 4. Marcus looked exactly as I remembered from company functions. Medium height, trim build, the salt and pepper beard he'd grown after his wife teased him about looking too young to be taken seriously. His expression, however, was unfamiliar, a mixture of anxiety and determination that spoke volumes about his current state of mind. "Mrs. Blackwood, thank you for seeing me," he began as I ushered him into Richard's study. I didn't know where else to turn. "Please, call me Amelia," I offered, gesturing toward the visitor's chair. "Richard always spoke of you with such high regard. I'm grateful you reached out." Marcus sat stiffly, hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I wouldn't involve you in company matters, especially so soon after Mr. Blackwood's passing, but this situation is unprecedented. I assume it concerns the company sale," I prompted gently. He nodded, tension evident in every line of his body. "Yesterday afternoon, we received departmental notices that all proprietary technology documentation needs to be uploaded to a new secure server by end-of-day Friday. The directive came directly from Oliver, flagged as highest priority." "That seems unusual timing," I observed, "just before introducing new ownership." "It's more than unusual, Mrs. Amelia. It's alarming." Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice despite us being alone in the house. "The transfer protocols aren't consistent with our security standards, and the destination isn't our regular backup system. It's an external server with minimal encryption." My breath caught. "He's extracting the intellectual property." Marcus's eyes widened at my immediate comprehension. "You understand what this means?" "I believe so." I kept my voice calm, despite the anger building inside me. "He's preparing to transfer Bradford's most valuable assets, your designs, patents, proprietary processes, to a separate entity before the ownership transition completes." Exactly. Relief washed over Marcus's features at being understood. We'd lose everything that makes the company valuable, just empty buildings and equipment remaining, while the intellectual property, the true value, would be controlled elsewhere. By Oliver, I presume. The brazenness of the scheme was breathtaking. Not content with undervaluing the company and stealing my share, Oliver was now planning to gut Bradford Precision's most valuable assets before the official transfer to Monarch Holdings. To me. "When did this directive come through?" I asked, mind racing through implications. "Yesterday afternoon." Marcus hesitated. "Shortly after Oliver left your house, according to the timestamp. So that was his contingency plan. If he couldn't control the estate and company through legal means, he would simply steal the intellectual property that gave Bradford Precision its true value." "Have you begun the transfers?" I asked. Marcus straightened, professional pride evident in his posture. "No. I implemented a technical delay, claimed system incompatibilities that need resolving. It bought us until tomorrow afternoon." "Us?" I questioned. "The core engineering team." His expression hardened. "We've worked with your husband for decades, Mrs. Blackwood. We know something isn't right. The valuation numbers Oliver shared with us don't match our project portfolios. The pension fund reports have discrepancies. And now, this rushed transfer of proprietary information. You've been watching," I realized, "all this time. Richard treated us like family," Marcus said simply. "We owe him better than silence while his company is dismantled. Family." The word struck me with unexpected force. While Oliver, actual family, had been systematically betraying his father's legacy, these employees had been quietly standing guard over it. "Marcus, what I'm about to tell you must remain confidential until tomorrow's board meeting," I said, making a split-second decision to trust this man, whom Richard had respected so deeply. "The sale to Monarch Holdings is legitimate, but Oliver doesn't know who's behind Monarch." His brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand." "I am Monarch Holdings," I stated simply. "Elizabeth Windsor is my maiden name. I established the company 6 months ago when Richard first suspected financial irregularities." Marcus stared at me, shock giving way to something that looked remarkably like delight. You've purchased the company? From Oliver?" "Yes, using the evidence of financial manipulation he himself provided during the negotiations with my representatives." A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. "Richard would have loved this. He helped design it," I confirmed. "Before his stroke made communication impossible." Marcus shook his head in wonderment. "What do you need from me?" "Delay the intellectual property transfer without raising suspicion. After tomorrow's board meeting, new security protocols will be implemented immediately. I paused, considering. And I may need your testimony regarding these irregular directives. You'll have it, he promised without hesitation. The entire engineering department will stand with you. We've just been waiting for someone to stand with. After Marcus left, I sat in Richard's chair for a long while, processing this latest development. Oliver's desperation was escalating, his tactics becoming more reckless. The quiet corporate fraud had evolved into blatant theft. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. My phone rang. Jonathan again. We may have a problem, he said without preamble. Oliver has called an emergency pre-meeting with select board members tomorrow. 8 a.m., 2 hours before the official session. Henderson and Patterson, I guessed, naming Oliver's allies on the board. And Westfield, Jonathan added grimly. The deciding vote on any emergency actions. The implications were clear. Oliver was attempting to secure board support for emergency measures, perhaps suspending the sale, removing intellectual property from the transaction, or worst of all, invoking a rarely used provision to declare me unfit to hold shares due to alleged cognitive impairment. We need to get ahead of this, I said, mind racing through options. What time does the building open? 7, Jonathan replied. Security arrives at 6:30. Then we'll be there at 6:15, I decided. I believe it's time Elizabeth Windsor made an early appearance. The Bradford Precision Technologies headquarters rose 15 stories above the surrounding industrial park, its glass and steel facade gleaming gold in the early morning light. Richard had overseen every detail of its construction 12 years ago, insisting on a design that balanced modern efficiency with subtle nods to traditional craftsmanship, much like the company's products themselves. Mrs. Blackwood. The night security guard's surprise was evident as Jonathan and I entered the lobby at precisely 6:17 a.m. We weren't expecting you. Hello, George, I replied, gratified that I remembered his name from company holiday parties. It's been too long. It sure has, ma'am. My deepest condolences about Mr. Blackwood. His expression was genuinely sorrowful. He was a good man, always remembered my kids' names. Thank you. I accepted his sympathy with a gracious nod. I believe my son has scheduled an early meeting with board members. We'd like to prepare the main conference room. If George found this request unusual, he gave no indication. Of course, ma'am. 15th floor. I'll notify daytime security you're here. As the elevator ascended, Jonathan reviewed our strategy one final time. Henderson and Patterson will arrive first, likely by 7:30. Oliver will brief them before Westfield arrives at 8 house. We need to be settled in the boardroom before any of them appear. And the documents? I confirmed. Jonathan patted his leather briefcase. Complete dossiers on the financial irregularities, the fraudulent company valuation, and Oliver's attempt to extract the intellectual property, plus the Monarch Holdings acquisition documents revealing you as the sole owner. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, a space I hadn't visited since the company's 10th anniversary celebration 3 years earlier. Little had changed. The same tasteful artwork depicting aerospace innovations throughout history, the same subtle gray carpet, the same wall of glass overlooking the manufacturing facilities below. The boardroom dominated the floor's eastern side, its 20-foot mahogany table gleaming under recessed lighting. Richard's chair, larger than the others and positioned at the head of the table, remained unoccupied since his stroke 8 months ago. According to Marcus, Oliver had never presumed to sit there during meetings, choosing instead the right-hand position traditionally reserved for the company president. Where should I sit? I asked Jonathan as we entered the empty room. He considered the options, then gestured to Richard's chair. There, it sends the clearest message. I hesitated, suddenly overwhelmed by the symbolism. To sit in Richard's place was to claim not just legal authority, but the mantle of leadership he had worn so naturally for decades. It's what he would want, Amelia, Jonathan said gently, reading my hesitation correctly. You're not replacing him. You're protecting what he built. With a deep breath, I settled into the high-backed leather chair, arranging the materials Jonathan provided in a neat array before me. From this position, I could see through the glass wall to the elevator bank and reception area. We would have clear visual warning when the others arrived. At 7:26 a.m., the elevator doors opened to reveal Henderson and Patterson deep in conversation. Both men froze momentarily upon seeing Jonathan through the glass wall of the boardroom, clearly visible as he arranged documents on the table. "Right on schedule," I murmured. A minute later, the boardroom door opened as Henderson, a florid man with the overfed look of someone who enjoyed too many expense account lunches, stepped inside, Patterson following close behind. "Mercer," Henderson acknowledged Jonathan with barely concealed hostility before his gaze settled on me with obvious shock. "Mrs. Blackwood, this is unexpected." "Good morning, Robert," I replied pleasantly. "Thomas, please join us." The men exchanged uneasy glances before taking seats as far from me as the table allowed. "I don't believe there's a board meeting scheduled until 10, Patterson ventured, his thin face pinched with anxiety. "Perhaps there's been some confusion?" "No confusion," I assured him. "I'm aware of the 8 o'clock pre-meeting Oliver arranged with you in Westfield. I simply thought we might have a different conversation first." Henderson's complexion deepened from pink to crimson. "With all due respect, Mrs. Blackwood, company business at this juncture is rather delicate. Perhaps it would be better if the majority shareholder weren't present for discussions about the company's future," I interrupted, my tone mild but firm. "I disagree." "Majority shareholder?" Patterson repeated, confusion evident. "But the sale to Monarch Holdings is proceeding exactly as planned," I confirmed, "though perhaps not as Oliver represented it to you." Before either man could respond, the elevator doors opened again to reveal my son. Even through the glass, I could see the moment he registered my presence in the boardroom. His step faltered, his expression shifting from confidence to shock and then calculated recovery in the space of seconds. When he entered the boardroom, his professional mask was firmly in place, though the slight tremor in his hands as he set down his briefcase betrayed his inner turmoil. "Mom," he greeted me with forced casualness. "This is unexpected. The grief counselor mentioned you might seek routine and familiar environments, but I hadn't anticipated you coming here." The patronizing implication that grief had compromised my judgment, a preview of the diminished capacity argument Jonathan had predicted, ignited a spark of anger I carefully controlled. "How thoughtful of you to be concerned about my mental state," I replied evenly. "I assure you, I'm thinking quite clearly." Oliver's gaze flicked to Jonathan, then back to me. "While we're always happy to see you, we do have a confidential business meeting scheduled. Perhaps Jonathan could drive you home, and we can speak later today?" "Actually," I countered, "this seems the perfect opportunity to address certain business matters directly, particularly regarding Monarch Holdings and the impending ownership transition." A flash of alarm crossed Oliver's features before he masked it with a condescending smile. "Mom, I understand you're upset about the sale, but these are complex corporate matters that the owner of Monarch Holdings should be quite familiar with," I finished for him. "Don't you agree?" The boardroom fell silent as my words registered. Henderson and Patterson exchanged confused glances while Oliver stared at me, calculation visible behind his eyes. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked carefully. Rather than answering directly, I removed a business card from the folder before me and slid it across the polished mahogany. The embossed cream cardstock bore the Monarch Holdings logo and a single name, Elizabeth A. Windsor, Chief Executive Officer. Oliver picked up the card, studying it with mounting confusion. "Elizabeth Windsor, you mentioned her before. What does this have to do with you?" "Elizabeth is my middle name," I said quietly. "Windsor is my maiden name." The blood drained from Oliver's face as comprehension dawned. That's not possible." "Quite possible," Jonathan interjected, sliding a document toward each man. "As these incorporation papers clearly demonstrate, Monarch Holdings is solely owned and controlled by Amelia Elizabeth Blackwood, formerly Windsor." Henderson snatched up the document, scanning it with increasingly frantic movements. "This can't be legal. The negotiations, the valuation process, were conducted with full transparency on Monarch's side," Jonathan finished smoothly. "If Mr. Blackwood chose not to investigate the purchasing entity thoroughly, that's hardly Mrs. Blackwood's responsibility." Oliver remained frozen, the business card still clutched between his fingers, as if it might somehow transform into something less damning. You've been behind this entire process? The emails, the conference calls, the negotiations were conducted by legitimate representatives of Monarch Holdings," I confirmed, following my explicit instructions. "Why?" The single word seemed torn from Oliver, raw with betrayal and confusion. "Why would you do this?" Before I could answer, the boardroom door opened once more to admit Marcus Torres, accompanied by a distinguished man in his 60s, whom I recognized as Harold Westfield, the board member Oliver had been counting on to support whatever emergency measures he had planned. "Mrs. Blackwood," Westfield greeted me with evident surprise. "I didn't expect to see you here this morning." "Apparently that's the consensus," I replied with a small smile. Though as the new owner of Bradford Precision Technologies, I thought my presence appropriate. Westfield's eyebrows shot upward. "I beg your pardon?" "She's claiming to be behind Monarch Holdings," Oliver interjected, finally finding his voice. "It's absurd. A misunderstanding, or worse, a manipulation by Mercer to—" "It's neither absurd nor a manipulation," Marcus interrupted, his normally respectful tone hardened with anger. "And there's more you all need to know before this conversation proceeds." He placed a flash drive on the table with deliberate care. "This contains evidence of systematic intellectual property theft attempted yesterday under Oliver's direct orders. Had we complied, Bradford's most valuable assets would have been transferred to an external server under his personal control before today's ownership transition completed." Oliver surged to his feet. "That's a lie. The transfers were standard security protocol for what?" I asked quietly. "For ensuring that after selling a hollowed-out company to Monarch Holdings, you would retain control of the patents and designs that give it actual value? The same patents and designs that weren't included in the valuation documents you provided during negotiations?" The silence that followed was absolute. Henderson and Patterson stared at Oliver with dawning horror as the implications became clear. Westfield's expression had transformed from confusion to cold assessment. "Perhaps," Jonathan suggested into the silence, "we should review the complete financial evidence before the full board arrives at 10. Mrs. Blackwood has some rather significant organizational changes to announce, and it would be helpful if certain irregularities were addressed privately first." Oliver looked from face to face, searching for an ally and finding none. Whatever he saw in my expression finally shattered his remaining composure. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed, gathering his materials with jerky movements. "This company has liabilities you know nothing about, commitments I've made that can't be undone with corporate maneuvering." "Actually," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily, "I know exactly what I've done. The question is whether you're prepared to face what you've done. Because one way or another, Oliver, that reckoning begins today." 10 o'clock arrived with the precision of corporate ritual. Board members filed into the room one by one, their expressions shifting from professional neutrality to barely concealed surprise at finding me seated in Richard's chair. Oliver had retreated to the far corner, engaged in an intense, whispered conversation with Henderson that ceased abruptly when the company secretary called the meeting to order. "As this is our first official gathering since the passing of Chairman Richard Blackwood," the secretary began, "I would first like to acknowledge our collective loss and extend condolences to Mrs. Blackwood and Oliver, who are both present today." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. I nodded in gracious acknowledgement, noting the confusion on several faces. My presence at a board meeting was unprecedented. In all the years Richard had led the company, I had maintained the careful distance expected of a corporate wife, attending only social functions and charity events. "Our primary agenda item today," the secretary continued, "is the introduction of new ownership following the sale to Monarch Holdings. Oliver Blackwood will present this transition plan, followed by—" "Actually," Jonathan interjected smoothly, "there's been a slight change to the program. Mrs. Blackwood will be making that presentation. As the principal of Monarch Holdings." The room erupted in confused whispers. Oliver remained rigidly in place, his expression unreadable, while Henderson and Patterson exchanged alarmed glances. The remaining board members, 7 distinguished individuals who had guided Bradford Precision alongside Richard for years, looked to me with varying degrees of confusion and curiosity. I rose slowly, drawing strength from Richard's memory and my own long-suppressed capabilities. "Thank you all for being here today. What I'm about to share will come as a surprise to most of you, though a few have been briefed on certain aspects already." My gaze swept the room, making brief eye contact with each person. 3 days after my husband's funeral, I was informed by my son that Bradford Precision Technologies had been sold to a company called Monarch Holdings for a valuation of $13 million. My share of that sale was presented as $10,000. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Several board members turned to stare at Oliver, whose jaw tightened visibly. This amount represented a significant undervaluation of the company, I continued calmly. A fact I was well aware of, having worked alongside Richard for decades in ways that weren't visible to most of you. I gestured to Jonathan, who distributed folders to each board member. What you're receiving is a comprehensive overview of Bradford Precision's actual financial position contrasted with the manipulated valuation presented to Monarch Holdings during negotiations. You'll also find documentation of systematic financial irregularities over the past 3 years, including diverted funds, misrepresented contracts, and most recently, an attempt to extract the company's intellectual property before today's ownership transition. The rustling of papers filled the silence as board members began examining the evidence. Oliver pushed away from the wall, his controlled facade finally cracking. "This is absurd," he declared, voice tight with suppressed anger. "My mother is understandably emotional following my father's death. She's being manipulated by Mercer into some misguided—" "Perhaps," interrupted Westfield, looking up from the documents with a furrowed brow. "You should explain why the McNally defense contract is listed here at $7 million when the board approved it at $12. Or why the pension fund shows a $4 million discrepancy." Oliver's momentary faltering was visible only to those watching closely. There are legitimate accounting explanations for those apparent discrepancies. If we could discuss this privately rather than ambushing me in front of— "Ambush," I repeated softly. An interesting choice of words from someone who presented his mother with a $10,000 settlement for her life's work. The room fell silent again. I continued with careful precision. "What you don't yet know is that Monarch Holdings was established 6 months ago by me, using my maiden name, Elizabeth Windsor. The company was created at Richard's suggestion when he first suspected financial irregularities but was too ill to investigate thoroughly. I withdrew another document from my folder. This is a certified copy of Monarch Holdings Incorporation papers, clearly showing me as the sole owner and director. Through this entity, I have legally acquired Bradford Precision Technologies from my son, who believed he was selling to an anonymous investment group. The silence that followed was profound. Board members looked between Oliver and me with expressions ranging from shock to dawning comprehension. Henderson had gone pale, while Patterson seemed to be calculating escape routes. Oliver finally broke the silence, his voice razor-edged. "Congratulations on your corporate espionage, Mother. I'm sure Dad would be proud of your deception." "Deception," I echoed, allowing the word to hang in the air. "Let's discuss deception, Oliver. Let's discuss the offshore accounts you established to receive kickbacks from suppliers, the patents you transferred to shell companies you personally control, the pension fund you've been systematically draining to cover personal investment losses." With each accusation, Oliver's expression hardened further, but he made no attempt to deny the charges. The board members' attention shuttled between us like spectators at a particularly brutal tennis match. "You have no proof," he finally stated, though his tone lacked conviction. Marcus Torres, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, cleared his throat. "Actually, we do." He tapped the flash drive now connected to the boardroom's projection system. "Financial transfers, email trails, server logs. Richard suspected something was wrong months ago and implemented additional security protocols without your knowledge." Oliver's eyes widened. "Dad was dying, confused. Whatever you think you have was meticulously documented by a man whose mind remained razor-sharp until his final days," I finished. "The stroke affected his body, Oliver, not his intellect. He saw what you were doing. He just couldn't confront you directly." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across my son's features. "If you had concerns, you should have come to me directly. This elaborate charade—" "Would you have listened?" I asked simply. "Would you have explained why you tried to cheat your mother out of her rightful share? Why you were prepared to send me to an assisted living facility in Charlotte while you liquidated my home? Why you betrayed not just your father's trust, but the security of every employee who believed in this company?" The questions hung unanswered as Oliver's gaze shifted calculatingly around the room, assessing potential allies and finding none. Westfield leaned forward, his expression grave. "Mrs. Blackwood, While these allegations are deeply troubling, I must ask, what are your intentions for the company moving forward? Bradford Precision employs over 300 people. There are contracts to fulfill, obligations to meet. It was the question I had anticipated, practical, focused on business continuity rather than family drama. Exactly what I would expect from the board member Richard had respected most. My intentions are straightforward, I replied. Bradford Precision will continue operations without interruption. All existing contracts will be honored. The pension fund will be restored to full solvency immediately. I paused, making eye contact with each board member in turn. And the organizational structure will be significantly revised, beginning today. Oliver's laugh held no humor. Let me guess. I'm fired? That would be the simplest solution, I acknowledged, but not necessarily the most beneficial for the company or its employees. Confusion replaced derision in Oliver's expression. Whatever he had expected, public humiliation, immediate termination, perhaps even criminal charges, this measured response clearly wasn't it. Before making decisions about personnel, I continued, I believe the board should review the complete evidence. Some of what you'll find is uncomfortable. Some is potentially criminal. All of it requires careful consideration of our legal and ethical obligations. I nodded to Jonathan, who stood. We've prepared individual briefings for each board member to review in private. I suggest we recess for 90 minutes to allow everyone to process this information. When we reconvene, Mrs. Blackwood will present her proposed restructuring plan. As board members filed out, clutching their folders with expressions ranging from shock to grim determination, Oliver remained rooted in place. When the room had emptied except for Jonathan, Marcus, and myself, he finally spoke. What game are you playing, Mother? His voice was low, dangerous. If you intended to destroy me, why this performance? Why not simply call the authorities? I studied my son's face, the features so like Richard's yet somehow harder, the ambition that had curdled into avarice, the intelligence directed towards self-interest rather than creation. Despite everything, my heart ached for the boy he had been and the man he had failed to become. Because despite what you've done, I answered quietly, you're still my son, and this company is still your father's legacy. I'm offering you one chance, Oliver, one opportunity to make this right. His expression flickered between calculation and something that might have been regret. So briefly I couldn't be certain I'd seen it at all. What exactly are you proposing? He asked cautiously. That, I replied, gathering my materials, is what we'll discuss when the board reconvenes. I suggest you use these 90 minutes to consider what matters most to you, because after today, nothing will ever be the same. As I left the boardroom, I felt the weight of Richard's absence acutely. He should have been there, witnessing the protection of all we had built together. Yet somehow, in the determined set of Marcus's shoulders as he guarded the sensitive materials, in Jonathan's quiet competence, in my own unexpected strength, I sensed Richard's presence continuing through the values he had instilled in all of us. The company would survive. The question that remained was whether my relationship with my son could do the same. The executive lounge on the 14th floor offered a panoramic view of the city Richard had loved, its skyline a testament to the ambition and industry he had embodied. I stood at the window, cup of tea cooling in my hands, as Jonathan reviewed the restructuring proposal one final time. The employee stock ownership plan is legally sound, he confirmed, though the board may have questions about the percentage allocation. 30% is unusually generous. It's what Richard wanted, I replied, watching clouds cast moving shadows across the urban landscape. He believed the people who built this company deserved to own a piece of it. Jonathan nodded, making a final notation. And regarding Oliver? The question I had been wrestling with since discovering my son's betrayal. The mother in me wanted to protect him, even now. The businesswoman couldn't ignore the damage he'd done. The widow felt obligated to honor Richard's legacy of integrity. The terms remain as discussed, I said finally. He can accept them or face the alternatives. A discreet knock preceded Marcus's entrance. The board members are returning to the conference room, Mrs. Blackwood, and, he hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. And, I prompted, Oliver is asking to speak with you privately before the session resumes. I exchanged glances with Jonathan, whose expression remained carefully neutral. Professional advice? I asked. As your attorney, I'd advise against any conversation without witnesses, he replied. As Richard's friend of 40 years, he sighed. Some matters transcend legal caution. I nodded. 10 minutes. Here, not his office, and you'll interrupt if we're not finished when the board is ready. Marcus left to relay my terms while Jonathan gathered his materials. Are you certain about this, Amelia? No, I admitted. But it may be our last opportunity for honesty before positions harden beyond reconciliation. After Jonathan departed, I remained at the window, watching the city rather than the door. When it finally opened, I sensed rather than saw Oliver's entrance, a shift in the air, the subtle scent of the cologne Richard had given him last Christmas. Mother. His voice held none of the arrogance from earlier. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I turned to face my son, struck by how weary he appeared. The polished corporate facade had crumbled, revealing the strain beneath. For a moment, I glimpsed the boy who had once come to me with scraped knees and broken toys, seeking comfort and repair. 10 minutes isn't long to explain years of deception, I observed, neither accusation nor forgiveness in my tone. Oliver moved to the opposite side of the room, maintaining distance between us. I'm not here to justify what I did. The evidence is comprehensive. Then why are you here? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Richard's that my heart contracted painfully. To understand what happens next. The board is reviewing documentation that could send me to prison. My career, my reputation, he faltered. Everything I've built is hanging by a thread. Everything we built, I corrected gently. This company wasn't your creation alone, Oliver. It was your father's life's work. It supported hundreds of families. It manufactured components that keep aircraft safely in the sky. It was never meant to be your personal treasure chest. He flinched as if I'd struck him. I know that now.